Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of Adventures Through the Mind. I'm your host, as always, James W. Gesso. This podcast is brought to you by listeners like yourself via donations over PayPal or cryptocurrency, as well as the generous support of my patrons on Patreon. A big thanks to those of you who've been leaving donations, and an extra big thanks to those patrons whose names are listed in the upper corner of this video on YouTube or in the description to this episode on jameswgesso.com or whatever podcatcher you happen to be listening to it on. If you would like to become a patron of the show or leave a one-time donation, I certainly, most definitely invite you to do so, and you can do so by checking out the links contained in the description to this episode on whatever podcatcher you're listening to this on, YouTube, or at jameswgesso.com. So today's guest is Stephen Gyllenhaal. Stephen is an award-winning film and television director, writer, and producer. His producing credits include the documentary In Utero, a cinematic rumination on life in the womb and its lasting impact on human development, human behavior, and the state of the world, which was written and directed by his wife, Kathleen. Stephen currently facilitates workshops centered around recent breakthroughs in neuroscience and a new therapeutic method called identity-oriented psychotrauma theory that addresses the earliest forms of psychological and physiological damage. He is also directing Uncharitable, a documentary about the nonprofit sector. So Stephen's on the show today to talk about what I think is a very important consideration for anyone that is tripping psychedelics, which is the impact early life experiences has on the manner in which we perceive ourselves and the world around us. And in particular, the experience we had when we were gestating inside the mother's womb, as well as backwards through generations prior to our conception. Now, this does not seem explicitly psychedelic, or at least explicitly relevant to a psychedelic experience, but in fact, I believe it really, really is. When I was booking this interview with Stephen, I was actually asked by his publicist why it was that I felt like having him on the show would be relevant to a content library that is so focused on psychedelics. And the answer to that question, I feel, is relevant not only to the interview itself, but to the other episodes that you've probably noticed that I released that don't seem to have anything explicitly to do with psychedelics at all. So I'm going to read to you the response that I sent to her because I feel it sort of nicely contains my thoughts on this particular question. Psychedelics are agents of exposure to the psychological material that normally dictates our experiences of life unconsciously. The exposure and subsequent integration of such material gives us greater response flexibility to the various nuances of our perception throughout life, as well as our self-awareness in general. But such an outcome from psychedelic use is not guaranteed. It is determined by the intellectual and emotional framework by which we enter into the experiences and by which we integrate those experiences. This means that one of the most important areas of understanding a person working with psychedelics needs is that of psychology. Even more specific from there, the subdomain of developmental psychology, especially as it relates to intergenerational trauma and limbic memory, is, I believe, a vital topic for cultivating not only self-awareness that contributes to a higher quality of life, but also to psychedelic literacy in general. That is why I think Stephen talking on In Utero would be so beneficial to my audience and my content as a whole. And it still is why I feel that this conversation, this interview with Stephen, is so positively contributing to the larger psychedelic discourse and my content as a whole. Not only that, I just really enjoyed my conversation with Stephen, and I think you're going to enjoy it too. So without much further ado, here is my conversation with Stephen Gyllenhaal on Adventures Through the Mind. Stephen Gyllenhaal, welcome to Adventures Through the Mind.
Thank you. A pleasure. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I recently watched the documentary that you produced that was directed by your wife, Kathleen, called In Utero. And
Right.
I mean, I'm going to present the general thesis as I have understood it, and I'd like you to correct and expand where necessary, which is that the environmental conditions that are present for the mother during the gestation period has a epigenetic and a psychological impact on the personality of the child and then the personality of the adult, and that impact is not insignificant in any way. It's very significant. What did I miss there in that description?
Nothing really. For those who don't know what epigenetics are, I would say it's tremendous amount of research, scientific research has gone into the realization that we are not our genetics. Genetics can be turned on and off by environment. So while you're an unborn baby and you're developing from conception onwards, the effects are as profound as anything else that's growing. A tiny plant doesn't have enough soil, or is stepped on, whatever, has a massive effect on what happens later on for the rest of the plant's life. And it's equally true with human beings. In fact, it's even more true because humans are so profoundly complex.
Mm-hmm. This documentary actually presents a fairly large set of complex and important ideas. So I really kind of wrestled for a little while with how to, what angle of approach to go into this with you. And I'm still not sure because it's such a big thing. We've never spoken before. But maybe one question I know that came up for me when I was thinking about the content of this documentary is, what degree of influence does the environment of the womb, the uteral environment, play on the personality, the psychology of a child, but also as an adult being, and why?
Well, I think one of the things that Gabor Mate talks about in the film is that every emotion has a chemical correlate. So you don't feel joy as a human being without there being a chemical aspect to that. Or fear, cortisol, all the various, combinations of chemicals. We have our feelings in our body. They're felt in our body, and our body is a very complicated combination of chemicals which shift and change, depending upon feelings. So there are two things happening in utero. One are just the plain old chemicals that are moving between mother and child through the umbilical cord. And, there's been a lot of evidence about that. You don't want to drink too much alcohol or alcohol at all. You want to be very careful about whatever you ingest. And I think most people are clearer about that than they were, let's say, 20, 30, 40 years ago. But it's equally true with whatever the emotions the mother is feeling, because those do have a chemical correlate and they go into the child. And because the child, depending upon the size from conception onwards, is so much smaller, the impact of that chemistry can be very profound. And this is an area where, we spend millions, even billions of dollars on all different issues, not so much on pregnancy and mothers as we do in a lot of other areas. So there's a lot more research that needs to be done to understand. To date, there's been still a tremendous amount of information, and there's increasing evidence that everything from schizophrenia, bipolar, in the more extreme ends of this, possibly even autism, and then less extreme depression, anxiety, all of those kinds of things really begin to be set in place while you're developing in the womb. It seems in some ways like an extremely logical thing to consider. When you're being constructed, what goes on in the environment during that construction would, of course, have a profound effect. It's fascinating that until recently, we didn't really consider it. We just considered, nothing happens until you're born, when in fact, pretty much everything is happening from, for your construction before you're born.
Hmm. And there's some really, we'll say, just biological medicine that we can point to there that seems very clear to point out. For example, like you said, the uteral environment is the environment that the fetus is assessing and organizing its biological and genetic development around. And so any type of biological agents, such as cortisol, which is a stress hormone, or oxytocin, which is, whatever, the cuddle hormone, that those would be part of the environmental conditions that this developing fetus would organize itself around. And there's evidence to suggest that a high cortisol environment for a fetus would then activate some sort of genetic response that makes it so that the fetus is more likely to trigger a threat response. The brain of a person is more likely to trigger a threat response later. So a high stress uteral environment would then contribute to an increasing likelihood for a person to have stress-related illnesses because of a hyperactive stress response system. And that's a...
Yeah, I think that... Yeah, I'm sorry.
No, please.
No, go ahead. Go ahead, finish. I'm sorry.
Okay, well, I was going to say that feels fairly easy to point to and say, oh yeah, well that makes sense because it's got like the materialistic science stamp of approval. But you make some other suggestions in the film that I think might be a little bit harder for people to bring on board, but to me felt very intuitive, which is that there's obviously this genetic biological component, but that there's a component wherein there's a psychological impact that then carries around in the subconscious of the person for the rest of their lives. I would love to hear what you wanted to interject with, and then I'd also love for you to explain a little bit about how uteral environment and very early life situations can contribute to a person's perception of themselves and perception of reality.
Well, I think first, we live in a culture which leans heavily on science and scientific methodology. And I have found in my life, as I've moved increasingly from being an artist, a filmmaker, and a poet, whatever, into being a scientist, because I've actually moved from doing narrative films in Hollywood to producing this documentary, and in fact have now set up an institute in Los Angeles called the Institute for Identity Development, which is looking at self-examination, self-exploration from a psychological methodology that comes out of Germany and Scandinavia, which really is able to get back to early childhood, early infancy, even some in utero experiences. And I can get into that later and we can discuss it. But I think when we begin to move into these areas, it's critical to, in my mind, it's critical to, as much as possible, stay as close as you can to scientific methodology, because it's so easy to go off into, just faith and pure intuition, which I think are valuable as sort of pioneers into the unknown. But we want to keep bringing ourselves back as much as possible to things that can be proven. So what's going on in psychology and in these areas has been enough research to go that a tremendous amount of psychological experiences do have a foundation in chemistry. And I think sometimes we lean on it too much, but that's there. And so we can start to look at things, for instance, and it talks about it in the film, where a mother who has been very stressed in her life and is stressed during the pregnancy delivers a child who is pretty stressed. Now, that's the good news and the bad news. Because if you're born in a war zone, and there's a lot of evidence around this right now. A mother who is dealing with war, is highly stressed, highly attentive to dangers around her, that goes into the unborn child, and that child is prepared for a war zone. And so it's kind of miraculous when you look at it, and moves far beyond Darwin, who thought it took generations. And what they're learning is it doesn't take generations to cause profound change. It can happen in one generation because of the process that happens from conception to birth. The problem with that is that, the good news is that wars don't always last forever. Mm-hmm. So that when a child is conceived and experiences its time in the womb during a war zone and in war, and the mother is highly activated to do that, and the war is over, that child is prepared for war, and so is not prepared for peace. And there is, as the film goes into, a tremendous amount of research around World War II, around Holocaust victims, around all of these people who have these children who inexplicably for a long time were profoundly stressed. They were stressed because they were ready for war. They would have been great in a war zone, but they weren't great in peacetime. And so as they grew up, they developed heart disease, they developed diabetes, they ate too much because they were prepared for an environment where there was no food. So they were going to eat whatever they could eat. They were genetically, epigenetically, which means on top of genetics, their genetics were shifted, so they would have been great in a war. But they weren't in a war anymore. Now, what's fascinating about all of this, and again, there's a tremendous amount of scientific research, which I want to keep leaning on, that this epigenetic shift, this shifting of the genetics, continued into another generation. So particularly with Holocaust victims and their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren, the same dynamics to deal with being in a concentration camp, for instance, existed 2-3 generations later. And it was really unclear until a number of the people in the film really began to put the links together, and there's been more and more confirmation of this, which brings us into the whole other issue during pregnancy, was transgenerational trauma, which means if your grandparents were in a war, actively in war, or had a natural disaster happen and during that period of time, the grandmother was pregnant, you're going to have inexplicable feelings of anxiety that seem inappropriate. But if you had been living in a time of natural disasters or in a time of war, it wouldn't be inappropriate at all. You'd be terrific. So anyway, that sort of in a nutshell is what's really emerging from the sciences.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I am a big fan of Stanislav Grof, and his perinatal psychology is something I'd like to ask you a little bit about later if we get to it. But one of the things that he talks about is that one of the greatest challenges the ego can face is not suffering, but the suffering that emerges with an incongruence between inner emotional tendencies and outer social context. And so if a child is born, adapted, ready for war, and there's no war, well, the war still exists inside of them, and they'll eventually either wage that war onto themselves or generate and contribute to scenarios that basically bring the war to their own life, but maybe more on a social, emotional, like an emotional social integrity rather than an actual war zone.
Yeah, I think that's very true. I think that we see that a lot. I think that they project war all around them. For instance, this is just a hypothesis. Someone walks up to you. You've been epigenetically prepared for someone walking up to you and possibly shooting you. That was the experience of your grandmother, but you're experiencing an aspect of that in your epigenetic structure, and so you're afraid of the person. And it makes all the sense in the world from from a biological point of view, passing it down from generation to generation to survive, it doesn't make sense in reality. So one of the big questions, which is not answered in the film and which we've been exploring since then, is, okay, how do you unravel this?
Mm-hmm. And I want to get there, but let's just table that for a minute, because you had mentioned there's these extreme situations that contribute to extreme results. But then there's less extreme situations. I mean, most regular people in the modern world, we'll say in the modern Western world anyways, depending on where they live, is not growing up in a war zone. And yet they're having this same impact of transgenerational trauma, as you call it, and also the impact of an unfriendly or a stressed or a troubled uteral environment. So I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about that, because this war zone, like can be a metaphor for a violent partner or a violent relationship or an abusive relationship. It could also be a metaphor for the challenges of being, say, a single mother in a socioeconomic system that requires a great deal of hard, like working for money, which can be fleeting depending on what sort of social bracket you're brought into, this quest for money in order to have security. So can you talk a little bit about the role that our, for general terms, like modern Western society is playing in the cultivation of a metaphorical war zone for the mother?
Well, I think to begin with, the Me Too movement is a very interesting place to examine where we sit right now, which is quite fascinating, because what it's doing is underlining what it's like to be a woman in contemporary Western culture and actually Eastern culture. I mean, it's not much different. And it's pretty bad, and my own experience, I've been around a long time. I've been married twice. I've have daughters and granddaughters, and I am like, it's very clear to me that women have been treated dreadfully. And you can pretend it's not true. Just like you can pretend it's not true that black men have been being shot, and now we know they're being shot all the time and they're being shot forever. And, it's like if you're, and this is off subject somewhat, only somewhat, if you're an African-American man, most people say, oh, no, it's fine. It's not fine. And now it's being documented. And it's not been fine for a long, long time.
Yeah.
And we can come into slavery a little bit in the transgenerational issues around transgenerational trauma issues around being African American. But let's just stay focused on women for a moment. Women didn't have a vote, 100 years ago. Women were seen as chattel 200 years ago. This has a profound effect on what it is to be a woman. And the women, it shouldn't be a surprise to anyone, who are carrying all the children. So that it's basically been a kind of war on women for as long as you can go back in time. Now, I don't want to over dramatize that. But when you look at an environment in which a woman is not equal to a man in a marriage, and that's under mostly good circumstances, that has an impact on that child. Bring family violence into it, bring, as you say, poverty into it, or bring too much money into it, where a child, is being raised by servants, or, the child is right away left, the moment it's born is sent off. Child isn't nursed. The child goes through crying it out, which has neurobiological damage, which is a whole nother subject. And that child has serious problems. And just, the way in the United States treats pregnant women, how women work right up until the time the child is born. And it's sort of a badge of honor in many cases. That's in the upper classes. In the lower classes, women work because they have to work. And there's tremendous amount of evidence, and we're coming out with a new film called The Bond, which is all about how critical that bond is and how important it is to, first of all, sort out all the transgenerational trauma, what went on with pregnancies with your mother and your father, actually, and your grandparents and sort of get a sense of what happened, and then talk to the baby. Think about the baby. Spend time with that developing child. Has a profound effect chemically on that child. So all of that is a kind of a war, which is not to diminish the even worse trauma of actually being in a war.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's particularly damaging.
Yeah, I think it was the metaphor that I'm about to say is from Viktor Frankl in his book. I think it's called Man's Search for Meaning, and it's something like it doesn't necessarily matter what the trauma is, because trauma for each person is trauma. It's all smoke in a room, and for one person, their trauma might be might be war zone, and for another person, their trauma might be abandonment, and the relative impact of that is still significant on the person, although the relative impact comparatively might say, oh, well, one person's issues aren't as serious as the other. It's important to recognize that for each individual person suffering from the impact of trauma, that trauma is their trauma and is significant, regardless of how traumatized other people are.
And I'm more comfortable having Viktor Frankl say that than me, because he, of course, suffered from profound trauma. I think that's true. I think also as you get into how complex a human being is, whether a trauma happens in the first trimester, the second trimester, or the third trimester also has impact. And there's a lot of evidence about that right now. And I've been dealing with a couple of people who in adult life have had major car accidents, but while they were in utero, had some kind of trauma happen early on in the pregnancy, and it's almost as if it echoed it, and it happened in a couple of cases, which is fascinating. I want to come back to Groth a little bit.
Sure, yeah, let's go there. Because
I think he was one of the pioneers, and is still one of the pioneers in this field. And he, at first I think he got a tremendous amount of data by using LSD, which was then outlawed. And then he got into heavy breathing as a strategy for getting back to early, birth experiences and maybe even some in utero experiences, although I think he focused mainly on the trauma of birth. And as an example about the trauma of birth, if the experience while being an unborn child is a relatively positive one, or is a positive one, and that's very possible too. So it's unusual, I think, in our culture now, but it is possible. Then the birth experience is not traumatic. The mother and child has a connection. The child is strong and capable, and the birth experience actually can become a kind of triumph. But in most cases, because there are such complications in the womb, for some of the reasons we've discussed, birth becomes a kind of terrifying and troubling experience, made worse by the medicalization, sometimes necessary but often not necessary, and the practitioners not really understanding how miraculously, almost infinitely complex we are. From the earliest moments, conception is spectacularly complex, through the development, through birth, and through our whole lives. I just am constantly struck now by how little we really take into account how stunning we are, each of us. And that gets lost. And so these practitioners who have been trained in a certain way don't really know how to hold a baby, don't know how to bring a baby into the world. Midwives are doing it better, and they're trying, but we're all just learning how miraculous we are.
I'm going to put this next one on table too, because I'd like to ask you a little bit about the potentials of psychedelic therapy when we get into the therapeutic approach that you're helping cultivate in Los Angeles, which is where you are now. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. But first, society is, I think, ultimately traumatizing our current civilization, whether regardless of what socioeconomic bracket, gender, whatever you land in, there's an impact of trauma on each person. And definitely, if we were to compare some of us have it a lot harder than others, but ultimately we're all being fairly negatively impacted by this oversimplification and ideological approach to the meaning of life and being that our current civilization seems to be enforcing upon us since prior to our birth.
I would just interrupt on that.
Yeah, please.
One point, which I think is important, is to not over-romanticize the past or even indigenous cultures.
Thank you.
I think that it's not been, very little has been understood about human beings from the very beginning. And in fact, I'm very optimistic. I think we've come some profound distance to starting to understand, and science has been a major part in this, of how stunningly complicated we are and how we're deserving of incredible care. So I just don't want to let the past become something that's better. In some ways, I think, although it's incrementally small, I think things are better now.
Yeah, I agree. I appreciate you jumping in and making that important point. What I was wanting to get at here is that it's this really large, interconnected, interrelated system of issues that are present in each person involved around the mother. And I think it might be easy for some people to, depending on their perception, misinterpret that what you're talking about here is it's all about the mother. Can you talk a little bit more about the role of the father, the larger community of adult caregivers on the mother's health and thus the child's health as well?
Yeah. Well, I'm a father, and I'd say a successful father. I have wonderful grown children, that have achieved, in a Western culture sense, tremendous success. 2 stunning granddaughters, and I now have a 3.5-year-old. Started all over again because I simply love children, and I think we have to be aware when we look at science that the mother is, I can't even put it into words how astonishingly important a mother is. How everything really does revolve around the mother. At best, and this is what this new film is really getting into, the bond between the mother and the developing baby from conception onwards, all the way through life, really. That the extent of that bond has a tremendous amount to do with the degree to which a human being can move through the world joyfully, productively, massively productively, or destructively. And I don't want to understate that importance. Now, as a father and a grandfather, I haven't always been the greatest, to be honest. I mean, I was in the movie business, and that took me away a lot, and I think there are implications around that I am attempting to address. But I think the most critical thing that a father can do, and a grandfather, is support the mother in every single way possible. Be profoundly supportive, and it's a great job. It's a great job. I think also my wife now has been teaching me this more and more. Listen to what she thinks and she feels. Make that follow that, which is exactly the reverse of a patriarchal culture, which is pretty much all the cultures that have existed back through indigenous times. It's all backwards. And in fact, as I've done that more and more, and I recommend it, I feel more like a man. I feel more powerful. I mean, there are a lot of complicated issues around this, and one has to look at each case individually. What happens, for instance, if a mother dies or a mother is incapacitated and there's a young child? Then the father becomes the substitute mother. And I think, that happens a lot. There's all in the surrogacy, and there's all these other things that I don't want to really get into today because they're so nuanced and it involves really looking at things very specifically. Science raises a lot of issues around this, but you then do the best you can. But you have to understand that if you're a substitute mother, there are problems. They can be addressed later on in life, but don't pretend there aren't problems. Bring science into this and go, we got some problems. We can resolve those problems, but let's not pretend they aren't there. The very best thing is a mother and child bond. And it's a little controversial nowadays, but so be it.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Thank you. So there are two thoughts that are coming up here, two areas that I'd like to explore. And I think one of them is about, I guess, actual tips, practices, practical information about what to do if you're a mother, or a a mother with a pregnant, oh my goodness, my language, a pregnant mother, or a mother actively with child outside of her body. Some practical tips there. And then also maybe as fathers, I'm an uncle and I feel like more of an uncle every single day. So maybe some tips for aunts and uncles as well. But I want to maybe explore a little bit more about the impact of developmental trauma, and do you call it just gestational trauma or in utero trauma? Do you have a specific word for that?
Just trauma.
Sure.
I mean, it's just trauma. I mean, this is like the thing that's important to understand is that, we should be developing through our whole life. Mm-hmm. Theoretically, the whole process of conception, gestation in utero, coming out, being an infant, developing. I mean, neurobiologically, we're not fully formed until around 29, 27, 28, 29. And then the other things start to happen, and I'm experiencing them as I get older. Mm-hmm. But those are also processes of development. I mean, as your body starts to shift, theoretically, I think you are in literature and cultures have talked about this for a long time. Move towards wisdom. You can't use your muscles anymore. You've got to move towards wisdom. So the whole process is development. So I think that just because you're unborn, you're no less a human being. Certainly after 12 to 14 weeks, one of the things that is not in the film, because it was too complicated to bring up, is that the first part of the brain that comes online is the most sophisticated part. Not the reptilian part, but the most sophisticated part. They don't understand why yet, but that's what comes online. They think it might have to do with the fact that the unborn child needs management. So very sophisticated aspects of the brain come on. So it's feeling and it's making sort of decisions that are very instinctive, but from a very, very early stage. So I would just call it trauma.
Excellent. Great. So where I was going with that is, and again, anything I say, if it isn't correct or it needs some clarification, please jump in there. But where I was going with this is that where we're traumatized is where we're stuck developmentally, at least psychologically. And so given that the issues of trauma that happen in utero as well as in early life has not been really properly recognized, or at least the context that breeds it has not been recognized socially or culturally until at least quite recently, there's a lot of adults who are walking around having never acknowledged that they're stuck somewhere on their developmental line and haven't been able to develop past that, but believe themselves to be seeing things clearly from adult perspective, but are actually stuck in the defensive adaptations employed to protect themselves from the wounds of childhood. Can you talk about that a little bit? And this is also a great segue to get into some of the things that you're working on in LA with helping adults move through childhood trauma.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of research that's been done in the last 25 years around trauma, PTSD, veterans. That really started back in World War I and has been slowly developing. The military uses it somewhat, not as much as they should, because they're strapped in their own way and they have their own mental approaches. But they've actually been, in many ways, advanced in the training. So there's a lot of information about PTSD and trauma, like war zone, in war zones again, which can be applied to early trauma. The other area that's profoundly important and has been researched more and more is the impact of bonding, of human beings bonding, and the healing impact of that. So primarily where I'm working now is the intersection between trauma research, trauma methodologies for healing, for improving, and also where does the bonding come into all of this. So let's say you start with first trimester unborn child. The mother is in a car accident. Huge amounts of cortisol kick through, plus all different other things that are way more complex that we still don't understand that cause a major trauma. And the child feels something huge. I mean, imagine when, and I had an experience, when was it just a horrible terror a little while ago. And I realized right after it happened, I just put it out of my mind and went on. And I'm an adult. So imagine being this 2-month-old being with a very sophisticated brain, having this terror go through it. And PTSD has really been, research has shown that what happens is the organism splits and takes that emotional experience and buries it. And then keeps a part of itself working to keep it buried. It takes an effort to keep it buried. And there's biological metaphors for that as well, around wounds and things like that. But that part is buried. But it's now an organism with some trauma in it. Then there's another trauma at, something happens, a screaming fight with the husband or a mother or a father or whatever at the last trimester. And that's another trauma that has to be buried because the organism would potentially, and this happens, die if it's too extreme. Mm-hmm. So it decides, and it makes a decision biologically, basically, am I going to live or is this too much, or am I going to live or am I going to die? And the way it functions, and there's a lot of, again, research around what happens biologically to bury something that is just too traumatic, it buries it. So now you've got a baby being born that's got, let's say, to keep it simple, 2 traumas. Now, why was there a car accident the first time? And why was there a fight with whoever with? That doesn't go away when the baby is born. So we can assume that there's some other traumas that go on. So I think, and certainly my experience with the work I've been doing is that's exactly right. It goes on. And then at a certain point, you have a 3-year-old who, as we were discussing earlier, is epigenetically designed to deal with, to survive. This may happen again. I need to function in a certain way. Am I making sense?
Yeah. What I'm hearing is there's sort of like this this mass that is produced, and this mass is a pain, and that the nervous system says, oh, like that pain means death, and so biologically the most important thing I can do, or evolutionarily the most important thing I could do, is not die. So let's bury that pain. And then if it repeats again, it's like the pain that's being buried sort of, it gets bigger. So there's more system that needs to be like, whoa, we need to be extra prepared now. And then later something else happens and it just adds to like, no, we have to be even more prepared, while adding to like the cumulative emotional charge of the trauma system. Does that?
Now, yeah, that's correct. Now, the one thing to be careful about, and this is outside of the scope of almost all of us, is you can't think about this in Newtonian terms. You have to think about this in quantum terms. We are much bigger than simply that. I mean, it gets mind blowing to a certain extent when you go, well, there's a cell, well, there's a molecule, well, but actually this isn't material at all. It's actually energy, and it goes deep, deep, deep down, way beyond what we can conceive at the tiniest level, just as it's impossible to figure out what's going on in the universe, which is massively huge. So there's an ability to survive that is stunningly beautiful. But so one has to be very, very careful about approaching this being. But what you do begin to see is a child in, let's say, first grade suddenly responding to the teacher in a certain way, very different from another child with a different set of traumas, and also a set of wonderful things. It's always a mix, almost always a mix. But that begins to explain why every child is different. Some of them are really troubled. And it also, then you have to throw into that the transgenerational trauma that was a couple of generations back, but which probably may have caused that fight with the mother and the father because of whatever happened to him. So it's sort of quantumly overwhelming, but it's explainable. So now you get to why am I anxious? Why can't I find a loving partner? Why can't I make a living? Why can't I make a living? Why can't I do a job I love? Those begin to become issues in your 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s, and then there are other issues as you get older. But maybe you don't ever get past those early issues. So I'm going to stop and let you guide me where you want to go.
Well,
at this point.
I guess maybe just like I'm going to try to maybe recapitulate what you're saying here, which is that there's this a line of continuity, a causal chain that echoes backwards into the generations that came before us, that have an influential factor on the context of our early life, and that context of our early life has a direct influential factor on the problems that we will face as adults. And typically some of the greater challenges that we're facing as adults are well-developed and very complex iterations of traumas that are seated in our early childhood environment, which again are, the part of a direct causal chain that echoes backwards through time. Does that sound about right?
Totally. And it's massively good news. It's profoundly, massively good news, because what it says to a 30-year-old or a 40-year-old or a 50-year-old is you aren't who you are because of some mystery. You aren't who you are because of your genetics. You aren't, as the Greeks thought, fated to live a certain life. It's explainable why you are who you are. And I think what I'm experiencing personally, and it's happened recently as I've been going through a lot of profound changes, is I always thought, I'm going to change and I'm going to do this work. I'm going to go deeper and deeper and back, and I'm going to suddenly become a different person. And I kind of woke up the other day and went, what's happened is I don't want to be a different person. I don't want to be like outside of me. I am who I am. I got lots of problems. I understand most of the reasons why. I feel the way I feel. And I don't want to lose that now. I just want to be functional. I just want to be happy as who I am. I don't want to be Obama. I don't want to be Trump. I don't want to be, Picasso. I actually want to be me, who I've been basically from the time I was conceived. I just don't want to be miserable. I don't want to be confused. And this work begins to break that down. It doesn't cause a huge transformation into another person. It just makes you understand who you are, and then it allows you to start to function in the world the way you really want to. So the question is, how do you go back and do that?
Yeah, that is the question. Yeah.
That's the real question. And I think that there have been a lot of pioneers that have been exploring this. I think I was just listening to Gabor Mate say something recently, who observed the system I'm using, and Gabor's in the movie, and he's a brilliant, brilliant thinker. And I think he's been on your show.
He hasn't, although I would love for him to be one day.
Yeah, he's great. So I thought he had, but anyway, he's great. And what he talks about is the only way you can face this stuff is when you feel safe. You must feel safe. And that's actually what you're trying to create in the womb, is a place where this miraculous little being can feel safe enough just to grow the way nature wants you to grow. So it's finding and creating a safe place. And how do you do that when you're beginning to face the traumas of your life? So that's what I've really turned to do with a good portion of my life now, is work with a system that's come out of Germany and Scandinavia, which came to us because they saw In Utero and they said, this is the first film that has captured what we've been understanding is happening in our work. It's group therapy, and it really comes out of a combination of, well, it comes out of family constellations, which Bert Hellinger uncovered while we're working with the Zulus in South Africa, where he was originally going to convert them and then went, whoa, wait a minute, they've got this much more together than I do. And what they were able to do, because they didn't have all the distractions, was they understood the profound resonance between people, that one person can sense what another person has been through in a very nuanced way. And there's no clear evidence, I would hypothesize that the bond between the mother and the child, where there's a physical connection, but there's also these other connections, is the kind of prototype for where that starts. Mm-hmm. But that has to happen in a safe way. And that's hard. That's hard to achieve. It's doable. I think, Groff, the problem with, and we can kind of get into pharmaceuticals and all of that, I think there was a danger. I mean, tremendous evidence that he pulled together around birth trauma using LSD, but I think there was a lot of trauma there too. And I think the breathing also, you get the evidence, but it doesn't mean the person's healing because it's not a safe environment. So how do you create a safe, really, really safe, loving environment for an adult? There's also the issue, which is what this newest film was about, the bond, which is let's get to the mothers when they're pregnant or when they're thinking about getting pregnant and get them doing the things, some of the techniques that make it possible in this stressful world to make it a safe place for that developing fetus, that developing unborn child.
I want you to maybe try to answer, as far as you can tell, like, what is it that creates that safety? But first, I want to maybe unpack a little bit about this safety issue, because what I'm hearing from you, and from my own research in this, is that the bond between the mother and child in utero and in not only just early life, but increasingly until that child is properly individuated as an adult, that relationship, that bond, needs to feel safe and secure for the full gambit of that child's emotions, for the full gambit of that child's feelings. And if we are traumatized, then that means that didn't happen somewhere along the way. And as an adult, now we need to basically uncover where it is that didn't happen, and then build outside of ourselves sort of like a proxy womb. Maybe that's not the right way to describe it, but sort of like a representation of the womb, or of the nest, a safe, secure environment for those feelings to be held, so that we can ultimately be able to nourish what we were lacking as children, so that frozen developmental process can unfold, and in that process develop a capacity for us to then provide that onto ourselves, so that we become properly individuated. We become to a place where we can nurture and support ourselves, and not be codependent upon others. And in that proper individuation, we can be healthier members of our community and have healthier relationships. Because I'm not trying to go all like forging off into the West lone wolf style here, but I mean that individuation is important, because then you can be a truly healthy contributing factor to a truly healthy, interdependent, good integrity community. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, I'm glad you sort of brought up that, I was very involved for a long time in adult children of alcoholics, and because my parents were alcoholics, and there was all of this, don't be codependent, it's like we are dependent on other people. We that's what human beings are. We need other human beings. We just don't need to bleed into each other. We don't need to be, we don't need to be lost in other people. It's learning how to have. It's learning how to go from being an unborn child, where you are kind of totally symbiotically connected with this person, and you have to go back and kind of start to clean those things up, to being someone who's separate, who has loving relationships, who has friendships, who not just, and I think the one piece I would add to what you were saying is, and what I'm seeing is, there is as much to be gained by sorting out your own stuff and taking care of yourself as there is by being there for some other people.
Great.
As long as you don't drown in the other people. It's like it seems to happen at the same time, particularly when you're doing kind of group therapy, which we can either get into now, or people can check out my website and sort of begin to explore what I'm getting to. But I think it's important to understand, and I think this is a problem with Western culture and contemporary culture, an area where we have fallen behind the past. Things don't happen overnight. Change doesn't happen overnight. Take joy and have a sense of triumph about it happening slowly. I had somebody say in one of my called constellations this past week, I'm okay with not being okay. And that to me was like, if one can hold on to that, which is not always easy, I'm okay with not being okay. Then you're okay. Then life isn't bad, even as if everything is wrong. And then slowly you can begin to take on the challenges that make it better and better.
Well, that's
and
part of that.
You can work your way back through the traumas.
Sorry to interrupt. That's part of that
Okay.
proper mother bond, right? When you can say I'm okay with being not okay, what you've done is you've put yourself in a situation where you have a capacity to hold yourself in security for the full gambit of your emotional experience, which was what was lacking for a whole, myriad of different potential reasons in the childhood development.
This brings up one other very, very important thing in this journey, and that is mothers, as I've said, biologically, psychologically, spiritually, although spiritual is a word I want to be careful with, but I also don't want to leave out of the picture, because at the very least the universe is massive, and you'd better stay attentive to that. And the molecular universe is also massive, so let's stay open to all of that. But the mother is profoundly important. But there is the temptation to demonize the mother for, my mother did this wrong, my mother did that wrong. The deeper you get into this work, the more that goes away. The more you also begin to see where your mother was brave, where your mother, or I can take my mother as an example, an alcoholic, had drug problems. I began to see her family and where she came from, and also being a woman after World War II, and a father and a husband who had PTSD, and all these things, was profoundly brave, even as she was massively damaging. Not because she wanted to be. She didn't have any understanding. And these women in the past who've caused so much damage for whatever reason, so much of it not their fault and some of it their fault, were trying generally to do the best they could do. And they need to be celebrated, and they need to be honored. And as we go deeper into the psychological, spiritual, and biological damage that was done, we need to still stay attentive to a sense of gratitude.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's really important. A man whose work I follow pretty deeply is Mark Wolin. He works with family constellation and inherited family trauma. And one of the things that he talks about is that you're never going to heal as long as you hold on to a victim narrative where your parent was your aggressor, and that the healing comes when you can acknowledge the things that they did, both good and bad, the things that they didn't do, both good and bad, in equal acknowledgement. That to recognize that, yeah, there was a lot of love that they didn't give, but they didn't give that because they couldn't give that. Yeah. And what they could give, they gave as much as they could. And so to be able to acknowledge that, yeah, they made a lot of mistakes and messed me up, and yeah, they did a lot to make sure that I was as loved as they were able of loving me, and that where they damaged me was not their fault. Like, they're not actually to blame. They were grappling with stuff just as I'm grappling with stuff. They made mistakes that injured me just like I've made mistakes that have injured others. And that if you look at the complexity of dynamics that contributes to the trauma of just one person, it's quick. It gets to a point where you have to acknowledge that really no one's to blame. Every individual person is responsible for their actions. But when it comes to trauma, there isn't a particular person to blame for it. I mean, developmental trauma, maybe they might get.
I think the one thing I know Mark, and I'm very, very fond of Mark. I mean, I think, I think he brings a tremendous amount to this narrative. But as a father and a grandfather, I think there's a very, very important place to communicate with one's children and one's grandchildren about what we did wrong. Mm-hmm. About, one of the problems with this work that I'm doing is that it gets very deep, and there's a lot of solid memories that start to emerge because other people around, a la the Zulus, a la quantum mechanics, people can feel the energy of other people, and they come up with very specific details about what went on in the client's early infancy, toddler, and before being born, birth. All those things begin to come up in very great detail. It's very helpful when you have a parent or we have some witnesses who can say, yes, that's what happened. Yes, that's what happened. I made a mistake. Why did I make the mistake? I mean, what is it? Is it mistake? What's the word? Sin. It comes from the Greek.
Miss the mark.
To miss the mark.
Yeah.
And that's basically, the mistake is the same thing. It's a mistake. It's like you go, it's critical for us to go back and say, confirm, this is what happened. I was there at your birth. I remember your birth. I have details about it. If they want to know, I mean, if they don't want to know, they'll come to you when they're ready. But I think that we are at fault. That's part of what the previous generation. That's what the part where you go, okay, so a woman is pregnant. One of the jobs of the parents, and if the grandparents would be the great grandparents, whatever, if they can share with that pregnant mother when she's ready what they know, what they did wrong, because what they did wrong may repeat itself in her pregnancy if we don't clean it up. So I think coming to solutions, one solution is that both the expectant mother and the expectant father go back as much as they can and search their history for what the pregnancies that were in the families, what they were about. So, for instance, as an example, there's a lot of evidence now is that if you are a child who was in a womb where there were 3 miscarriages, you're in a womb where there has been death, where there's literally been a death. And that resonates in the biology of that woman. Women don't talk about it. I've been through some miscarriages. They are death. They are death. They are profoundly, and you talk with any women who really would talk about it, it's devastating, devastating.
And
so
it's
are
completely
abortions.
suppressed in our culture. I remember listening to a great podcast with Daniel Vitalis talking about with his sister about miscarriage, and one of the things she mentioned is that like you don't realize that your sisters, your mothers, your grandmothers, your aunts, your friends, that they've had miscarriages until you've had one, and then all of a sudden they're there for support. But up until that point, you're alone in it because there's this profound stigma.
And I think one of the things to also consider doing is that if you're pregnant, you find yourself pregnant, don't wait until you're confirmed everything's okay. Let a few people know. So if there is a miscarriage, you can go for some comfort, because then that womb and that being is being allowed to grieve, is allowed to heal, is allowed to weep, is allowed to share it. And then when that child does come later on, it's in a womb that has wisdom in it. I mean, if that's the right word biologically to use, but I think it is, because I think you can't separate Franz Rupert, who I work with a lot out of Germany, and the method that I'm working on is called IOPT, which is a kind of a combination of a bunch of different things. But he says, how do you put it? He says, don't ever say I have a body. That's implying that there's a mind with a body. There is no separation. It's all one thing. So the spiritual, which I will talk about it again with some reservations, psychological and biological are all completely interconnected. And any sense that there's a separation is living something that's false. So whatever one can do on the level of having had a miscarriage before a child, try and address it and process that. Also try and go back and see your relatives and talk with your relatives and ask them what your own, when you were in womb, was like, what it was like for them. So you begin to get a sense of the history of it. And then as uncles and aunts and parents and grandparents, be available. Be honest. The truth sets us free. That's the only thing that's going to set us free. Everybody, as much as you can, because it's sometimes really hard.
Oh, yeah.
Be as truthful as you can and as loving in that as you can. But the truth is loving, I think, finally, as long as you can deliver it carefully. And then I think, so as much as possible, prepare for that pregnancy. If you're pregnant, do it as well as you can. And this new film, The Bond, gets into two issues. One is sort of going back and looking at history, and the other is understand that you are communicating with that developing baby all the time. Talk to the baby. People know that. Feel the baby. There's a thing called prenatal bonding that comes out of Seattle, which is in the film a mild amount. Check that out. And we're going to get more and more into that. The In Utero the film has pushed us more and more into, okay, what are the solutions? So let's solve the problem at the beginning if we can. Let's address that. And the problems are huge. There should be family leave. There should be mother and father leave like there is in Sweden. I mean, it's outrageous what's going on in this country. That's a whole nother subject, but it's very important that mothers need to be able to take time off. And then there's the adult. Then, okay, you never got that. You're now 40 years old. You're anxious. Let's now use all this research to go back and gently and lovingly in a safe place start to address these things slowly and carefully. Be okay for yourself not to be okay. Love yourself for that. Kind of create, as you say, a metaphorical womb. I'd be careful about getting too specific about that, but start to play with that and start to clean it up. And then as you clean it up, you become an adult who, when a friend of yours or a child or whatever is pregnant, be there a little bit. Always open the door for a pregnant woman. Always. Particularly a pregnant woman with a child. Be aware of pregnant women. All of us can do that. It's hard being pregnant. Open a door, smile, do the things all those things help. Those are just little things, but they help. So.
Yeah, that's excellent. That was one of the questions I wanted to get into later, because though there was some solutions or positive perspective offered at the end of In Utero, it really left me wondering, so what now? Like, what do we do? And those are some great suggestions. And in honor of time, and like you had mentioned, there are a lot of just nuances. I could pick, what about this scenario? What about this scenario?
Yeah.
So we'll leave that. But I want to, before we end the interview, I want to unpack a little bit more about the treatment of adults, in particular, two aspects. One, what it means to create a safe space, and two, just your thoughts around psychedelics. And I'll ask those separately because I have a very particular way I'd like to form the psychedelic question. Right. So with regards to safety and building safe spaces for people, I think, and this has been a big point of discussion in my community here in Kitchener, which is just sort of a stone's throw from Toronto, and the safe space movement is really strong around here. And sometimes I think that safe spaces get misrepresented. The intention is good, but there's this misrepresentation, this misunderstanding that a safe space means a space where nobody can be made to feel upset, that there's no behaviors or words that are spoken that could possibly upset another person, which feels almost impossible, especially for traumatized people, because the safer an environment gets, the more a person's guards will go down and the more likely their vulnerable parts are going to be triggered, or at least from my perspective. So maybe you can either first off correct me if you feel like I'm off base here, but unpack what you mean when you say building a safe space for people inside of a group context.
I think one looks at how do you survive, first of all, just as a human being on planet Earth in 2018, how do you survive it? How do you survive? It's a profound question when you're an unborn baby, because there are a lot of miscarriages. So you're very, very fragile. And most mothers don't know that what they're doing is putting their child at risk. I mean, and sometimes they do know they're putting their child at risk, and they're so terrified that puts the child at risk, or certainly at the risk for some damage. So first and foremost, there's a need to survive. And we've talked earlier about some of the mechanisms of survival, splitting off, burying it, and then keeping that survival in place so you continue to survive. I've come to understand, and I'm new to the field of self-examination on a formal level in setting up this institute, because I've been a filmmaker up until this last about 6 months. I'm growing increasingly respectful of survival mechanisms. Do not traumatize those survival mechanisms. Do not confront them. There's a lot of therapies that are into confront the survival mechanism, deal with address that, fight it, break it down. I was in a therapy for a long time, an analysis actually, which was all about breaking down the organism, the psychological structures, and then rebuild them in the image of, I guess, the analyst, which didn't work. That one has to be very, very respectful of those survival mechanisms, which can be really weird. I mean, really, really weird. I think, I was just in Europe, and you go, for centuries, they believed in little boys and girls, mainly boys, with wings floating around above us all the time, angels floating around, and people believed in it. Now you look at this beautiful images and all that, but we don't really believe in that anymore. It just goes, well, that's just not really realistic. We know if you're spiritual, you believe in certain things, but not little beautiful babies running around with wings. But this was right after the Black Plague. And people needed whatever they could get just to make it through the day and deal with all the, transgenerational trauma of that. So give them angels with wings. Give them all these things to help them get through it. But then slowly begin to examine that, and we have as a civilization, we've moved beyond that. So I think a safe place is being attentive to survival methods, the survival strategies, but be aware that they may not be all that safe. I mean, I've come to a conclusion that in a strange way, as one is protecting what it is you're experiencing, which is the self, which is the identity, when you're protecting that and things get so bad and it's so at risk, and you're feeling so horrible in your life and so confused, you have no tools for understanding why that is, suicide becomes a form of survival. You're going to survive with what it is you are by killing yourself. Now, it's obviously a very extreme example, and we've talked about a lot of extreme examples here, but there are graduations of that in which the survival strategy is unsafe. But you've got to go really carefully about that, and you've got to trust the client. I mean, I believe more and more, listen. If you're a therapist, or if you're what I am, which is a facilitator, because this is an uncertified form of self-examination, listen really, really carefully. Be really, really gentle, and let the being guide you. And slowly begin to remove, one survival strategy, I won't talk to anybody because it's just too painful. Well, at a certain point, not talking to anybody becomes dangerous. So you have to slowly help the person get to talking to somebody.
I'm thinking,
figure out a way to do it.
I'm seeing this this metaphor coming up about the trauma being this wound, okay, or I was thinking a tiger. It's like a wounded tiger or something, but you put a cage around it, like you put these walls up to protect it. But eventually, as it grows and it grows and it grows, it actually becomes dangerous onto itself, and now you're trapped inside with it. Does that how does that metaphor
totally
fit?
The metaphor fits, except that the mind of a human being is more complex and nuanced, and both more damaged, but also more capable of healing than a tiger. So that you have to speak to the tiger or the person inside that cage and have them guide you how to get out. As an example, and most people will not have seen the film, but obviously I recommend that they do see In Utero. There's an issue I have with the film, which is the concept of the imprint, in which, as it was when we were learning about it, which is now all over the world, this imprint, neurobiologically, epigenetically, and psychologically, it's a term that's being used. It implies that there is this helpless organism which is imprinted with something. And we sort of talk about trauma. There's a trauma that comes in and shocks the organism, and that's what was going on. That's not what's going on. What's going on is a trauma has come at the organism, and the organism decides how to address that. Do I die? Is it too much? Do I repress it this way? Do I do this? The organism, first biologically, psychologically, spiritually, are all tangled up in each other. It makes a decision as to how to handle it, which means the organism had the dynamics. The human being has the dynamics within it to address trauma. So you don't want to get in the way of that dynamic. You want to speak to that tiger, which is really an incredibly complicated human being, and gently, through dreams, through resonating with other people, through whatever they come up with, let them say, I'm ready to take that bar down, but no more. Just want to see a little bit over there. And then slowly it begins to come down. Now, I'm honestly new to this. I've been trained by some of the best people in the world now. Luckily, I'm a white guy, and I've have the capability of doing things a lot of people don't have. I'm very privileged. So I've had tremendous training in this stuff. Let's tune in a year and I'll talk more about this. But I'm finding that that's the solution. Let the client lead the way.
Yeah, excellent. I do some facilitation myself for people, mostly people who are struggling with the impact of having gone through a very painful psychedelic experience. And oh wow, I feel embarrassed, but I just gapped on what I was going to say.
It's okay.
All right, either it'll come back or it won't. Let's move on to the next question. Whew, okay. So
it's fine. You can cut that out and then you can reshoot it later.
Just like add it in. All right, so let's go into this. Oh, there it was. Okay, that to build a space, to help co-create a space wherein the person who's coming to talk with me that's struggling with their experience, that there's an invitation for the natural healing intelligence of the organism to unfold unhindered, not to go in and dismantle things, to take things apart, to fix stuff, to break stuff, but just whatever context needs to happen within certain limitations that enable that natural healing intelligence to unfold unhindered. And it sounds to me like that's something that you're sort of leaning into as well.
No, yeah. I'm okay to not be okay. Mm-hmm. I'm okay to not be okay, and then that begins to allow nature to come back into the picture.
Mm-hmm. So let's, again, in the interest of time, this is fantastic conversation, Stephen. Thank you. Let's finish off. I want to ask this question about psychedelics. You mentioned there were some harmful elements there with Groff's work with the exposure of trauma and the unsafe scenarios, including in breath work. And there's some consideration too. I mean, Carl Jung said, beware of unearned wisdom, and psychedelics definitely confront us with what's there, whether or not we're ready for it. And if we're not ready for it, it can be profoundly troubling. Yeah. There's also some fairly good anecdotal and even some neurobiological evidence that the ingestion of things like LSD and psilocybin can contribute to a brain state that's very similar to ones that are present in childhood. Now, I don't want to use one fMRI study to try to justify some sort of concept that may or may not have base, but anecdotally, people talk about going back to the womb. They talk about going back to a regressive child place. So there's a good possibility there for accessing those stuck energies. And then there's also a really good possibility that might happen outside of a safe context, and end up actually just be profoundly hindering a person or degrading their quality of life, making something worse before it was even bad. Right. I mean, I kind of think I just got my ideas out. I'm not sure where the question is, but I'd love for you to speak on this too. I know LA, in California, the psychedelic scene, the psychedelic therapy scene is really strong for the research and such. What are your thoughts on what's happening with psychedelic therapy? And from your experience facilitating these group sessions, what type of advice would you have, or perspectives that you have around the potentials as well as the potential benefits as well as the potential dangers of psychedelics being incorporated into trauma therapy?
Well, first of all, I don't know the science behind it and the research that's going on. It's not an area that I've put my focus. So I can't speak to it as an expert. Secondly, there's a part of me that goes, at worst, not at worst, but certainly one has to examine the possibility that, like beautiful little cupids with wings, this is serving a purpose, but it may not be the best way to go. That being said, there are so many dreadful things out there that I can't judge it, and then I won't judge it, both because I'm not privy to the really cutting edge research, and I think one has to be profoundly respectful of all the survival strategies that are out there. So there's that piece of it. The other piece of it is I grew up in the 60s, so I did everything. And so I have personal experience with all of these things. My experience was I almost didn't make it in Yosemite at the top of a cliff taking LSD. I became delusional and I almost dropped off a cliff because I lost.
Whoa. I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt this, but this is so wild that you said that, because last night I had that, and you made me remember. I'm sorry for interrupting. I had this dream, and the dream context was I was on a trip with friends, not psychedelic, but the concept was I was on a trip with friends to climb these walls that were extremely high, these cliffs that were extremely high, on this bungee cord that was like sort of like an auto belay system. and that we were just supposed to climb up and jump down, climb up and jump down, but we got all the way up to the top. But then once I was at the top, my belay system came apart and I was stuck on this massively high thing that I would die if I fell off. And I was terrified of trying to reconnect my belay system and trust that the belay would even take me down safely. And yeah, sorry to interrupt. That's just such a strange synchronicity.
Well, I think, and this is sort of like comes back to the issue of spirituality. Not to get too off track, I'll come back, but just one has to be attentive, as with all of these things, with what is spirituality, or how does the world work, or what is quantum mechanics. I mean, the great thing about quantum mechanics is now we know we don't know very much. We thought for a long time with Newtonian physics and Enlightenment and computers and Apple and Steve Jobs and everything else that we were really at the pinnacle of the human species on some level or other. Now we know, no, we're nowhere. So let's stay open to the fact that, I had this experience, it showed up in your dream, who knows what all that means, not go too far with it and not base anything on our life on it, which I think a lot of people do, which I think is problematic, but go, that's kind of wild.
Yeah, give it permission to be wondered around, right? Like, give it permission to wonder.
Well, I think also give ourselves permission to understand that we are massively bigger than we think we are. And we can't take our educated, essentially Newtonian brains and try and apply it to our life experience, because we are much, much bigger than we imagine we are, and that we've been taught we are. So anyway, we shared an experience on almost dying on a cliff.
Okay,
mine
great.
was my experience was that it's dangerous stuff. My experience was I grew up in a very religious environment, and I was very Newtonianly driven. And psychedelics blew my mind apart on some level, and I think brought something into my life. So I want to be attentive to that. But it didn't take me very far. It didn't really take me to a 68-year-old guy with grandchildren and children and some semblance of wisdom and a sense that the next 25 years or however long I'm going to live are going to be pretty fucking fascinating. Because I'm awake, and that really came through a lot of mistakes. I mean, most of my experiences in psychiatry, and I've been in almost every form of therapy imaginable and analysis, because I was crazy, were mistakes. We're going down wrong roads. But they have been leading me more and more to something that I think that really is at the cutting edge of where we are now, which is that we can resonate, and that's, again, another conversation. So I would approach psychedelics as with anything, with as much scientific methodology as is possible, with as much awakeness as possible. So if it's not working, get out fast. With an awareness that you are dealing with something that is massively miraculous, complex, and don't for a moment buy into the confused culture that we live in that says you're a simple being and all you need is Coca-Cola or, a nice car or whatever. It's easy. I've done it myself, to buy into that's going to solve anything. If you're armed with that, when you approach these things, you're going to be in trouble. So be very, very careful. I'm never going to do it again. I'm kind of leaning towards saying to people, look, try my method. It's not without risk, too. It's not. I mean, you open up to your early traumas, it's hard. None of this stuff is without risk. But if you don't live a life that is willing to take on risk and grow, then you're in the least safe place you could possibly be in. And you'll probably die early. And you'll probably die lost and sad and confused. And I don't wish that on my worst enemy.
Yeah, that's a fantastic piece there, Stephen. I definitely agree with you on your preparatory concerns if one person were to use psychedelics, exploring the peer-reviewed, validated context scenario, like information to build a safe and interesting context. I'd be curious, actually, if you ever do end up taking psychedelics again, Stephen. I would love for you to privately contact me and let me know, because definitely the context plays a huge role. And you as a young man in the 60s, amongst probably the most reckless era of LSD, and that whole thing with very little wisdom or guidance around for what it means to be tripping any type of psychedelics, doing so in irresponsible contexts, would certainly prove to be a different experience than you as a fully grown, well-developed, highly educated man, educated on the psyche and yourself. And I, if you ever do, I mean, this is just an invitation. I would love to hear privately from you if your thoughts and ideas around its potentials shift at all.
I think in all honesty, have to say that I think there's room for people exploring everything in all different areas. I can say pretty honestly that that's not the direction I'm going to go, but I want to share my experiences with anyone at all who is journeying on all of this. I'm finding that the work that I'm doing, which is astonishing and is connected to indigenous healing, in which 5 or 6 of us with someone who is really trying to figure out what they want, the fact that I can experience what went on in their childhood, for instance, or toddler or infancy or even in utero, I can experience that, and this gets confirmed by responsible adults around, brings a chemistry into my being that is not far from what I experienced when I was doing drugs as a young man, and that it is transformative. And I think it's closer to nature, from my experience, than indigenous people have used various forms of chemistry. But I think it's closer to real nature, but I'm going to have to prove that, and I'll work on it for the rest of my life, and we'll continue to have conversations from, I think, that perspective. Yeah,
excellent. I really respect your position. Though we have slightly differing views on psychedelics, I'm really 100% on board with you about the potential of a well calibrated and effective context that is not relying on any type of exopharmacology to generate, and certainly the fact that we can enter profoundly psychedelic states of mind simply through the feeling response in the right container. So I think it's absolutely excellent. I just want to reinforce how much I respect that approach. Stephen, thank you very much for being on the show today.
Pleasure.
For the listeners, where can they find out more about your work, your upcoming documentaries, and where can they watch In Utero?
Well, In Utero can be watched on our site, inutero.com. Just look up In Utero, and you'll get first the album, the Nirvana album, and then you'll find us, just In Utero, the film, and you'll find that there. Most of the information is there. We're self-distributing it because we had a fancy distributor doing it. We were making no money on it, and it was on all the Netflix and blah 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 and all these things, and they were taking all the money, and we couldn't get any of the emails. So we decided we're trying to create a community. So we took it off of all that. So it's only on our website right now. It's kind of expensive. I'm trying to pay back the cost of it. I'll give you a secret. Maybe what we can do is we can get a discount for your listeners. That'd
be excellent. I'll include it in the outro, which I record in post-production.
And you should talk with Simona, and she'll set that up. My assistant will get that worked out so they can get that. And then the bond, which is going to be out in the next couple of months, which is for pregnant women, really designed for pregnant women, very much gentler than In Utero, because In Utero is tough. There's elements of In Utero that are tough.
Yeah.
This is much gentler. And then within the next 2 years, there'll be an additional film which really goes into much more detail about how you solve this. That's our next film.
Sounds like an excellent trilogy.
So that's So I think also you can get all. So you go to In Utero, the film. Look up that, and also you can go to either IOPT USA or the Institute for Identity Development to see what I'm working on in terms of this therapy.
I assume you have a newsletter, maybe a Twitter feed that you'd like to promote here?
I'm not so good at that right now. And actually, I've been very careful. I mean, this is just between you and I. I really wanted to take the first 6 months of setting this up to be sure it was working before I started really marketing it. So there's all the Twitter feeds and everything. You can get that from. I'm terrible at this. You can maybe do it underneath. Simona has all that stuff.
I'll make sure to seek it out.
Okay, that's in utero, and then she can give you some information on IOPT. But I've been very careful not to over market it. But come June 1st, it's going to be starting to be seriously marketed, because I then feel confident that everything's in place to really market this, everywhere.
Great. Well, by just between you and me, I hope you meant just between you and me and all the people who are listening. It'll be fairly close to June. I'll plan it that way, that this gets released so that it doesn't strangely overlap. And for the listeners, I will make sure that all the links that Stephen has just offered and not yet offered, but I will will be available at the show notes to this episode at jameswjesso.com. Stephen, thanks for being on the show.
A real pleasure. Really, really a pleasure.
And cut. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Adventures Through the Mind. If you liked it and you're watching it on YouTube, give it a thumbs up. Either way, please share it with a friend or a few friends, or, just on the public, semi-public domain of your social media walls, wherever they might be. You can also further support the show by leaving me a one-time donation via PayPal or cryptocurrency, or by becoming my patron on Patreon. That financial support is really, really helpful to the development, sustainability, and growth of this show. So I thank you deeply for supporting it. As in accordance to when this interview is released, I am just soon going to be heading out on a European travel speaking tour, and we'll be catching several interviews on the road, in person, face-to-face, in video, and I'm really, really excited about that. And your financial support is not only going to help me get to those different places to interview those people, but also help me invest in and replace, if broken, or repair the technology that I need in order to do that. And I'm really looking forward to that, and I'm really grateful to everyone who has helped support the funding of this project as a whole, the Adventures Through the Mind, and specifically the project of getting on-location interviews this summer. Again, links to supporting the show financially are contained in the description to this episode. You can find, regardless of whether or not you support the show financially, please do follow me on social media at JamesWJesso on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Especially Instagram if you're really interested in what's going to be happening with me this summer on tour, because I love travel blogging on Instagram. Anyways, that's it for now. I'll see you on the next episode of Adventures Through the Mind. Take care.